And joining us tonight for a discussion on what to expect this 2026 is our resident geopolitical analyst, Richard Heydarian. Good evening, Richard, and Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you also, Stes.
All right, where are you?
Sorry, nasa Baguio ako ngayon, back home.
Okay. So, we just heard the two highest leaders of the land in their New Year messages talking about unity and bagong Pilipinas. Parang lip service lang.
Parang ito yung rehash nung nangyari the year earlier, kaso hindi sila magkasama, di ba? Kasi usually ating magkasama sila, di ba? Especially in the earlier years of the BBM administration, but now they're doing it separately. I think if you look at 2025, talagang dito nabuksan yung Pandora's box, no? Really, once unimaginable things happened, including, of course, yung detention and handing over of former President Rodrigo Duterte to the International Criminal Court. Unimaginable things happening, like fears of potential coup d'etat, or hundreds of thousands of people coming out dun sa protesta laban sa corruption scandals. Unimaginable things like Ferdinand Marcos positioning himself as a crusader against corruption and in favor of good governance. Not to mention also, it was a year of really ang daming tensions din sa West Philippine Sea, including that major incident sa West Philippine Sea na nagsalpukan yung dalawang Chinese major vessels, which really raised concerns about potential escalation in the West Philippine Sea, especially with the second Trump presidency also coming in and adding new uncertainties. So it was a year of wild swings. But in many ways, parang ano rin siya, may pagka-postmodern simulacra rin siya. A lot of war over positioning, performativity, about optics and PR. Kaya wala pa tayong decisive direction pagdating sa ating politika. But I think this year, 2026, most likely makikita natin there'll be some major tectonic shifts in Philippine politics.
Okay, there is now a complaint against the VP in the Office of the Ombudsman. Do you see the Ombudsman acting swiftly on this?
I think yung unang malaking bagay na papanorin ng lahat, not only observers, pero kasama dyan yung ating mga kababayan, is yung final list, for instance, na ilalabas ng Ombudsman on sino mga kakasuhan, no? Kung sinong may certainty of conviction base sa determinasyon ng Ombudsman when it comes to sa flood control projects. And then at the same time, of course, whether the Ombudsman will also recommend potential articles of impeachment against Sara Duterte, kasi malilift na by February, di ba? Yung basically yung time limit dun sa refiling of impeachment against the Vice President. Except this time, mag-apply na yung rules ng Supreme Court unless there's going to be a major Supreme Court ruling or amendment based dun sa motion for reconsideration na final ng iba't ibang grupo last year. But as things stand, baka as early as February, we would see some major developments. We will know about the list of ombudsman, sino dun sa mga sangkot, sa mga scandals, sa flood control scandals, na malalaking mga legislators ay potentially could face prosecution. And at the same time, whether the ombudsman will also be proactive enough to potentially initiate a new round of impeachment against the vice president. Kaya sabi ko nga, this year could be the decisive year.
Do you have faith in the Ombudsman acting swiftly? Because, when Ombudsman Remulla assumed the position, he was giving interviews left and right and giving assurances and promises that, sadly hindi nangyari because we were expecting at least a big, so-called big fish by Christmas. But it's now January 1. So may paniniwala ka pa ba sa kakayahan ni Ombudsman Remulla?
Well, unang-una, I mean, the base was very low, no? Yung previous ombudsman ay pwede mo sabihin na political figure, no? Halos walang ginawa. And potentially even work in the reverse direction in terms of ensuring accountability, whether dun sa salain ng dating administration, top officials, or whether allegedly even on some cases involving some of the senators who are now, once again, potentially could face prosecution for involvement in corruption scandals. So coming from that base, And not to mention the Remulias were not necessarily known as paragons of good governance. I mean, you could say they were like, of an established political family known as decisive and everything like that. But I think given yung ganyan background, to be fair to former Justice Secretary Boying Remulla, I think he has definitely come a long, long way. Huge improvement ang nakita natin. But as you correctly pointed out, says no, it looks like there was some over-promising. And I think there was some pressure. I mean, who appointed Boying Remulla to is the president? And what was the position of president? Yung Christmas gift sa taong bayan is by the end of the year, may mga big fish na makukulong, or at least we'll have some clarity. Sino mga big fish ay pwede makasuhan ng Ombudsman Office? Well, we have at least one, right? One of the Discayas at least is now in detention. I don't think small fish sila. Siguro yung iba, small whale or big whale, pero walang small fish sa kanila. Lahat sila involved
Pero
dito sa mga...
Richard, we're talking about government officials, people in positions of power.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. Kaya hindi ako nag-disagree sa'yo. What I'm saying is that I think there was a pressure on the ombudsman considering he owed his appointment to the president to kind of, not naman humor, pero to tag along. Kaya sabi ko parang simulacra last year. Lahat nagpo-position, there's a lot of performative.
So
there's a lot of
performative
optic-
masyado ngayon, deliver na. One thing, and I don't know if you agree with me, these government officials, dishing out, they keep talking, making pronouncements. It chips at their credibility. Kasi gusto natin maniwala pero wala naman. So what should you advise them to do, 'di ba? This time, mag-action na lang muna sila, wag na muna sila magsalita kung hindi naman mangyayari.
Well, I mean, if you talk to a lot of top legal experts, legal luminaries, I mean, they would have said na medyo unrealistic talaga yung by December. So we're looking at 3, 4, 5 months. That realistically, you're looking at early this year. This is not an excuse. This was about yung just the logistics, di ba? Yung reality. Kasi syempre, ang gusto mo, kapag kinasuhan, yung mga malalaking tao who are capable of hiring the best lawyers ever, playing politics and all, gusto mo sigurado, di ba? Airtight. So, it remains to be seen whether the reason why hindi nangyari yan by December and we're still waiting for it. Ang gusto natin marinig is whether the reason for that is not because may negosasyon nangyari behind the scenes, whether may kalokohan na nangyari dito, baka naman meron legitimate reason which is gusto nila airtight yung cases. Kasi, I mean, remember, last year was kind of a winning streak for a lot of people involved in corruption scandals. Ilan ang na-acquit ng Sandigan Bayan?
Yes.
The Binites were acquitted. Enrile, the late Enrile were acquitted. Napoles was acquitted. Some of the Marcos Cronis cases were acquitted. The list goes on and on and on. Ang dami na-acquit last year sa Sandigan Bayan. Which tells you, siguro, pag ombudsman, you're gonna push ahead with this. Airtight mo yan para hindi 3, 4, 5, 10 years down the road, na-acquit na naman lahat ng mga yan, di ba? Para hindi lang zarsuela. So, I'm not making an excuse. I'm just saying, sana the reason is not because may kakaibang nangyayari, Mickey Mouse business or negosasyon nangyayari, who's on the list, who's not on the list. Sana is because we want to make this legally airtight. As far as the promises to the administration is concerned, I think, parati ko sinabi, when was the last time we had a Filipino president promising good governance? That was the Dan Matuid of Pinoy. Did it work for him politically? Not really. Because the more you talk about corruption, the more there's exposure of corruption, the more magiging cynical ang tao, the more people will ask for accountability, the more magiging politically risky and some would even say unrealistic for the president to deliver. Because tataas at tataas, di ba? Yung investigation. I mean, let's not forget, towards the end of the year, no less than the presidential son had to go to the ICI. We can debate about how credible ICI or how effective ICI has been. But people are eventually gonna ask, what about the president himself? Ilan sa kanya mga cabinet members ay napa-alis sa pwesto? Maybe they know something, right? So, I think the president really painted himself into a corner. And I think the wish of the president is he can just do just good enough for people to be happy. And then because ASEAN chair tayo this year and darating mga world leaders, maybe the agenda and the media coverage will shift. But he has opened up the Pandora's box na eh. Kaya nga, this is going to be a very tough year for the president.
So how do you see him navigating 2026?
As I said, as far as the corruption issue is concerned, hahanapin niya yung Goldilocks, di ba? Just enough high-profile people ay potentially eventually makakasuhan na ombudsman, and just enough high-level corruption will be exposed but not so much na mag-implode yung kanyang alliance. Remember, some of the key allies of the president paid the political price, at least. I mean, at least lost their position, like Martin Romualdez, among other things, right? So, baka at some point, kung ay approval or satisfaction mo ay -3 na, at that's more than a month ago, who knows, baka -10 na ngayon, at papunta ka na sa Gloria Macapagal Arroyo territory in terms of satisfaction rating, you have to be also careful. I mean, this is just politics. You have to be careful, baka mamaya bumaliktad pa yung mga allies mo in your lame duck years. Next
Okay,
thing you know, baka may impeachment complaint pa sa kanya. So if you're Marcos, you're hoping that you don't alienate enough people in the Congress or the Senate to create a total backlash in your lame duck years. And at the same time, sana ma-shift yung focus mo into the big international issues as we chair the ASEAN this year.
right. So as we chair the ASEAN and global attention will be trained in the Philippines, ano kaya ang what legacy is BBM hoping for, as an ASEAN leader?
Absolutely. Well, unang-una, of course, alam natin na this year, hindi naman dapat tayo nag-ASEAN chair. It was supposed to be Myanmar. Diba? If you follow it alphabetically and chronologically. So obviously, may kailangan tayong gawin about the Myanmar situation. There was just a sham election recently. We have to make a statement about it, whether we recognize that or not. East Timor, finally, hindi tayo lang yung Christian majority or Catholic majority country in ASEAN. Meron tayong isa pang bansa, East Timor, Timor-Leste, sumama. Dapat tulungan natin ang East Timor to fully integrate into ASEAN and to be ready also to host major events like ASEAN once their time for chairmanship comes. Pero obviously, I mean, if there's one issue whereby Marcos Jr. has, I would say, more or less, categorically would say, done well, or at least well enough, ito yung West Philippine Sea issue. I think on this issue, in fairness, I'll give it to the president. I know there's all this propaganda, tuta siya ng
Yeah.
Amerika, we're gonna be the Ukraine of Asia, and all of this nonsense. But the reality is that so far, China has blinked. How many times na-expose ng Pilipinas, ang Philippine Coast Guard, AFP, yung mga kababalakan at kalokohan ng ginagawa ng China sa West Philippine Sea, all the bullying and all of that. And yet here we are. The US has not abandoned the Philippines. We're not the Ukraine of Asia. And if anything, actually lumakas pa yung alyansa natin. I mean, in 2025, I went to 6 major capitals across Europe and Asia. Lahat sila, they want to develop their relationship with us, their strategic relations with us. The French, the Germans, the Brits, the Kiwis, the Indians, Japanese, all of them. And Canadians, obviously, most importantly, who
Yeah.
just signed also the reciprocal agreement. So kung ikaw si Marcos, yung West Philippine Sea feeling ko, yung pinakamaganda niyang potentially legacy, at yun ang i-consolidate niya this year. And realistically, I think what
Pero,
he wants...
Richard, there's really no hope of getting everyone on board on signing a code of conduct that's, acceptable to everyone. And do you expect some ASEAN nations to stand up to China? Baka hindi.
Perfect question. That was exactly where I was going. Dun sa issue ng code of conduct, malabo yan. I think China has been humoring us for 2 decades or so. They build whole cities faster than they negotiate provisions or titles of the code of conduct. Let's be
True.
honest. Like in the past 20 years, just look at Chongqing or even some of the smaller cities in China. They're mega cities now. So obviously, China is not interested in any real legally binding rules-based on-clause bill. But I won't be surprised though. Marami magkakaroon ng intra-ASEAN bilateral maritime delimitation, boundary delimitation negotiations. Mahalaga yan, So if this year, hopefully, God willing, ma-finalize natin yung maritime boundary delimitation negotiations natin with Vietnam, katulad ng ginawa ng Vietnam, Indonesia. Basically, ano to? Okay, yung China, they claim everything. So mahirap kausapin yan, di ba? So ang ayaw lang natin mangyari is may mamatay or may gulo. Pero doon, yung Vietnam and Indonesia, sinigurado nila, ito sa akin, ito sa'yo, hindi naman tayo nag-aaway eh. At gagawin din natin sa Vietnam yan. Eventually, actually says, if the Philippines manages to negotiate all of its maritime boundaries with Brunei, Malaysia, and Vietnam, then it's clear sino ang source ng problem. Hindi tayo, hindi Vietnam, hindi Malaysia. It's going to be China because China claims everything, right? Habang tayo and Vietnam and Malaysia, pwede mo naman i-delimit yan. And last time I checked, Vietnam and Malaysia also accept UNCLOS, including the relevant provisions of the arbitral ruling we won back in 2016. So, yes, tama ka. Don't expect anything big as far as ASEAN China is concerned. But I think as far as intra-ASEAN cooperation on South China Sea or West Philippines is concerned, meron tayong pag-asa. I think there's something we can get at the end of the year. And then at the same time, I think it's a priority of the president to make sure Xi Jinping comes to town and also Donald Trump. He wants all of those big players to be here in Manila later this year. So I think in the meantime, de-escalation na lang. Realistically ang gusto natin with China. Do nothing crazy. In fact, recently I just had a meeting with the new Chinese ambassador to Manila, and he made it very clear. I mean, this is public, so hindi ito confidential. Stabilization yung kanyang priority. So I think all of us are realistic. Nothing fantastic is going to happen with China anytime soon. But at least in the coming months, we want to stabilize that situation. And for Marcos, that's the most realistic best case scenario. And that's going to be the big legacy he's going to harp on in his final years as the defender of the West Philippine Sea and a rules-based order in the region.
Well, hopefully something will come out of this corruption scandal. People will be made accountable and jailed. And as you said, parang maghanap lang siya ng konti to satisfy the public clamor.
Just good enough, yeah. I mean, that's just the realpolitik tayo here. Personally, of course, gusto ko lahat ng mga kurakot makulong. Hindi naman worse than that. Pero kung baka, next thing you know, wala na tayong gobyerno. If mangyari yan, baka we'll get anarchy. But I don't want to say more. I know you got someone else to do the forecasting about the year, Sally, but
Well,
leave it to the next expert. I will just keep it at this
Yes,
level.
the feng shui expert will be more candid than you. I hope. Thank you so much for your time and joining us on the first day of the year of 2026, geopolitical analyst Richard Heydarian.